All right, welcome everybody. I'm Alan Levine, together with my colleague Tom Merrill. I run the Political Theory Institute, the host of today's event. This is our last event of academic year 2023-24. So stay tuned for next year when we hope to have another exciting schedule. Since it is our last event, I want to go out of my way to thank some people, Michelle Keegan and everybody in the comms team, and Sunyata Curry, who do the work behind the scenes that help make this happen. Our speaker today is Lorraine Pangle, a professor of political philosophy in the Department of Government and co-director of the Thomas Jefferson Center for the Study of Core Texts and Ideas at the University of Texas at Austin. She's the author of 5 books, one on Socratic political thought, one on Ben Franklin, one on the founders and education, and 2 on Aristotle. I'll read those titles: Reason and Character, The Moral Foundations of Aristotelian Political Philosophy, and Aristotle and the Philosophy of Friendship. She's also published several articles and book chapters on Plato, Xenophon, Aristotle, the American founders, and the philosophy of education. She's had several prestigious fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada, and the Earhart Foundation. Her BA is from Yale, and her PhD is from the University of Chicago's Committee on Social Thought. And as our last event of the year, this is really a PTI special kind of thing. It's a real pleasure to have such a distinguished and thoughtful scholar trying to address the current sad state of the nation by bringing to bear the work of one of the deepest thinkers ever to write. So here we are for today's talk, Aristotle's Advice for America. Lorraine, thank you.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I was not expecting such a distinguished audience, but I will do my best to live up to the example you set here in Washington of bringing all kinds of thoughtful people together. Just a generation ago, after the Cold War ended, liberal democracy was advancing around the world so impressively that it seemed to have no serious ideological rivals left. There were still a few communist regimes and many authoritarian ones, but democracy seemed to be what everybody ultimately aspired to, prompting Francis Fukuyama to proclaim that we'd reached the end of history, the point where all the great questions of human history have in principle been solved, even if it might take considerable time for those principles to work themselves out everywhere. Now liberal democracy is in retreat abroad and in trouble here at home. Confidence in all of our basic institutions is in sharp decline, and so is belief in democracy itself, especially among our young people. There are lots of different aspects to our troubles. There are many different alleged causes, many proposed remedies, almost all of which have some merit. But I think what's most ominous is the decline of a common purpose, a shared American vision of human thriving, of the kind of country and community that deserves our dedication, and the kind of citizens that we should all be striving to be. I think if we had that common vision, we could navigate our differences constructively, but we don't. For most of our history, we've had more agreement on our core principles. The principle of equality under law and limited government, whose first task was to protect Americans' freedoms and rights. Our worst divisions have come not around our basic principles, but around our failure to extend them to all Americans. We still have a commitment to equality and liberty and rights, but we no longer agree about what they mean. Is the equality that matters equal prosperity for everyone, or equality of opportunity with unequal results? Is it equal representation of each ascriptive group in every profession and organization, or is the love of equality at bottom just a hatred for elites? Does freedom mean minimal government interference in individual choices to leave us free for pursuing our own purposes, or vigorous government intervention to provide freedom from the deprivations that hold us back? Do rights include the right to life or to abortion, to own guns, or to be secure from violence? Are rights primarily for citizens or for everyone who shows up at our border? Our very agreements have become the issues around which we're most divided. In perplexity, it's always good to return to first principles. And when we turn back to the American founding with our current divisions in mind, and maybe with a little help from Aristotle, we find, I think, three great paradoxes. The first paradox is that our constitutional system has worked impressively well on what may be faulty premises about human nature. Our founders devised an enormously beneficial system of government built around the rule of law, equality under the law, extensive individual freedoms, many enshrined as constitutional rights, representation through democratic elections, separation of powers, independent judiciary, federalism, all of these very good things. And the benefits that they have brought us are terrific advances in peace and security and health and prosperity and toleration and protection of citizens against oppression. The premises that once provided the theoretical basis for this project of liberal democracy all began with the state of nature. Hobbes, Locke, Spinoza, Montesquieu each give a different version of it, sometimes presenting the state of nature as the prehistory of the whole race, sometimes as a thought experiment, sometimes as an exceptional but recurring state of crisis that's especially revealing. But they all contend that to grasp this state is to grasp the deepest truths about the human condition. That by nature we're separate, independent, detached, self-interested, acquisitive individuals. We don't have any natural end or perfection. We're equal, above all, because we're equally vulnerable to violent death, and therefore equally endowed with a right of self-defense. This and other basic rights, including the right to acquire property, are possessions that we own as individuals prior to society. Out of this hypothesized human condition, Enlightenment thinkers, and especially Locke, justified the liberal project of resting government on the low but solid foundations of self-interest and directing it to the protection of rights and a comfortable self-preservation. The paradox here is that nobody really believes in the state of nature anymore. Nobody has for a long time. Evolution teaches that early humans weren't solitary at all, but intensely social beings. A second paradox is that this liberal project that appealed to self-interest and the celebration of individual rights worked so well for such a long time only because it was supplemented by other commitments and habits, deeply American commitments and habits that Lockean liberalism didn't provide and was even in some tension with, but that our founders definitely respected and drew on. These include the biblical faith or faiths, ideals of statesmanship and civic virtues inherited from the classical republicanism of Greece and Rome, characteristic American habits of collective self-help through voluntary and civic associations, and the traditional family. The third paradox is that while we don't accept the state of nature as a historical reality, we've come increasingly to believe the story it teaches us about ourselves as self-interested, rights-bearing individuals, each on our own to make what we can of life. A number of observers connect the shift to a serious fraying of our social fabric. And one of the most critical is Patrick Deneen, who argues in Why Liberalism Failed that the effort to liberate individuals from all the institutions and traditions that once constrained us has left us individually isolated, weak, and helpless in the face of an ever more powerful government. Unlike our founders who spoke confidently about nature and nature's God, to us, nature seems to give no guidance at all. Modern science teaches that nature is blind, and many social scientists deny that humans even have a nature. With such a view of nature, reason doesn't seem to give much guidance either. People claim that reason teaches us facts, but from facts about what is, nothing follows about what's good. Direction seems to come only from faiths we increasingly don't share or from personal preferences we can't defend. For a long time, our lack of a compelling grounding for our political principles scarcely seemed to matter. We went on as if they needed no grounding. Or we imagined that we could base our principles on relativism itself. You've all heard the argument that since nothing is really true or false or right or wrong in itself, it's right to give everyone maximum freedom and wrong to interfere with their freedom. But that's not logical. And that view, apart from its lack of logic, I think it has proved too thin a gruel for the human spirit. Humans need causes to believe in. Now on both the left and the right, we see a new moral fervor, but with an impoverished moral vocabulary. Not a vocabulary of good character or of virtues well articulated, but of grievances and assertions of non-negotiable rights. So far, a majority of us still embrace democracy, but as we reject guidance from nature, do we have any grounds for believing in the equal dignity of human beings and in equal rights, except feelings? And aren't feelings an especially easy thing to change? I submit that a great deal of what ails America could be improved, and much of what's good about it could be better supported and guided by supplementing our founding principles, which are richer than mere state of nature theorizing, supplementing those founding principles with another older source of our tradition, ancient republicanism, and especially Aristotle, beginning with his richer anthropology, or account of human nature. If we could enlist Aristotle as a consultant, I think he'd likely say nature is more robust and offers more guidance than we think. We think of ourselves as isolated individuals, but by nature we're social and political. We think of our relations with one another in terms of rights, and if we remember to add corresponding duties, but it's better to think of moral and political relations in terms of the virtues that are the perfections of our nature and the common good that's also grounded in human nature. So how does Aristotle understand human nature? He famously defines a human being as a rational political animal. First of all, we're animals, and Aristotle is fascinated by animals. His biology is a careful study of all kinds of living beings, each one of which has an ordering principle that keeps it at work, being itself, as he puts it, and producing others of its kind. To know what a living being is to know what it does and how it functions and what's good for it. Functioning is most obvious with parts. An eye is there to see. To know what an eye is and does is to know what a good eye is and does. And the same, Aristotle thinks, is true of whole beings. We only understand what a beaver is by understanding what a healthy, thriving beaver is and does. Nature determines not only what a beaver is, but what's good for it. And we can say a lot about that. The clean water and the trees and the freedom that it needs and the way it builds dams and eats bark and raises its young, all of which are essential to a thriving beaver existence. Just like beavers, humans are living beings with needs and desires and vulnerabilities. We can be healthy or sick, and it's health that's good. We're defined by the bodily characteristics of the species, including its way of reproducing. Aristotle says we're beings that naturally seek to overcome our mortality by leaving behind others like ourselves. It's part of ancient realism to accept our biological nature and to be respectful of the way it defines us, though it never simply determines us. It's part of the classical approach to take the natural health of the body as a model, as an analogy for the health of the soul, and to try to understand the health of the soul in the same way. Second, Aristotle says a human is a political animal. And by this, he means we're not just gregarious like herd animals, but we're social in a way that unites us into ordered wholes. From birth, we find ourselves embedded in families that we come to love as our own. We love our closest kin and friends as other selves. We form groups that range against other groups with leaders and followers. We share a profound human inclination to join others in purposeful action. First for defense, but also for higher activities that give life meaning. Our groups naturally grow and coalesce until they form self-sufficient sovereign political communities under regimes that profoundly shape the smaller associations within them. And finally, to call humans political for Aristotle is to say that human nature is most fully realized in one particular kind of sovereign community, a polis or free city, large enough for independence, but small enough to unite its citizens in powerful bonds of affection and to govern itself through collective face-to-face deliberations. And here we begin to see the paradox in Aristotle's concept of nature, because the polis is both a natural perfection and a very rare achievement in human history. But it's the achievement that he thinks is most fulfilling for humans and therefore most natural. Essential to our political nature, if also transcending it in a way, is our yearning for the noble, that is, for a meaning that lifts us above our animal existence with its bodily needs and pleasures. This yearning directs us to public service, to heroism, to piety, and to philosophy. And yet this very directedness to the noble brings us into conflicts. It leads societies to embrace common faiths and stories and authoritative accounts of life's meaning, to try to put these beyond question and to challenge these accounts. Now, the fact that we're given to challenging one another is part of what it means to be political and part of our rational nature, but it's also tied to something else in human nature. We're in one way more political even than other animals like bees, Aristotle says, but in another way, we're more separate or independent. In fact, he says in the history of animals, a human being is one of the animals that dualizes. We're both political and independent. But he stresses our political nature in his Ethics and Politics, where he gives guidance for educators and statesmen. We all know how self-interested we can be. What he thinks we need to understand better to live well is how political we are and what it takes to fulfill that. To say that humans are naturally political isn't to say we all want to rule, but it is to say that we're all concerned with right and wrong, what's good and bad, not only for ourselves, but for others we care about and for our whole community. It's to say that to thrive, we need to be engaged with others on a small or a large scale in working together for good ends and upholding laws and norms that we affirm as our own and as just. Aristotle makes the claim at the beginning of both the Nicomachean Ethics and the Politics that just as the political community aims at the comprehensive good of a people, the political art or science is or should be the most authoritative art. These statements bring us to the crux of the difference between modern liberalism and ancient republicanism. We're doubtful that there even is any such knowledge of the human good as Aristotle claims, and we think government shouldn't be getting involved in trying to promote it except in very limited ways. Aristotle is often taken to mean that the political community is properly authoritative over every sphere of life, including morals, including religion, and that we have a duty to bow to the political authorities in everything. I think his claim is actually rather different. Not that any political community deserves this authority. We don't. But that the political community is willy-nilly authoritative, and a good political science recognizes that and takes on that very heavy responsibility. Because part of what it means for humans to be political beings is that we're the kinds of beings that do tend to decide the most important questions collectively, either by participating in self-rule or by deferring to somebody whose authority we accept. Aristotle stresses that what the leading citizens in each place honor, everyone tends to honor. What the law requires, we tend to take seriously, and what the law doesn't have anything to say about, we tend to think is optional and a matter of personal choice. Thomas Jefferson echoes this thought when he says, the way to silence theological disputes is to take no notice of them. So we have to decide what we're going to decide about, how much, how far. We have to be thinking about how that shapes the souls of character of citizens when we do that. And he thinks we're the kind of beings who have a deep need to be in some way part of a bigger whole and engaged with others in meaningful undertakings. So our political nature gives us a shared responsibility to help direct our lives together that we can't evade. Now, if nature gives us a need for meaning and for justice, does it tell us what these are? Not directly, but it does give us clues. First, in our very need for community, and hence in the need for civic virtue to sustain it. We see the need for civic virtue through its decay in America today. We need each other to be law-abiding. We need each other to respect the results of elections and the institutions that protect democracy. We need each other to be informed and to vote for good candidates who will put the common good ahead of their partisan advantage, and that's been decaying. Aristotle's most serious teaching on virtue, though, is not that it's primarily what the community needs of individuals, but it's what we need of ourselves to thrive in a life of purposeful engagement with the world. The active, intelligent exercise of virtue, according to Aristotle, is the core of happiness. In his teaching, virtue has a complex relationship to nature. Virtue, like the polis, is a perfection of nature, but it's one that nature itself doesn't simply provide. Virtues like moderation and justice and practical wisdom don't come naturally. And yet living in accordance with them is naturally fulfilling when we can achieve it. An analogy: by nature, we don't play tennis, but we can say it's naturally healthy and satisfying to play tennis and to play it well, and even that there's a natural way to serve a ball, the way that puts our natural capacities to maximum use to put speed on the ball without stress on the shoulder. Figuring out how to cultivate virtue and how to live together in self-governing communities is harder than figuring out how to serve a tennis ball, not just because these are more complicated, but because there's a lot in our nature that gets in the way. Laziness and greed and narrow selfishness and irrational impulses and contentiousness that aren't good even for us. Nature doesn't make life simple for us the way it does for beavers. We have to invent our dams and argue with each other and even with ourselves about how to do it. But nature does give us a foundation for virtue in a natural goodwill that we have for others, in the capacity for reason, in a rudimentary sense of justice and concern for dignity that need education, but that give us direction, and in the satisfactions of developing these things well. Reflecting our complex natures, Aristotle argues that good character needs complex supports. It can't be instilled merely by force and fear. It needs inspiring models and examples, and it needs practice supervised with love. It needs practical wisdom to guide it, which requires extensive education. But it also needs the sanction of law as an ultimate support. Aristotle gives a paradoxical teaching on law and the noble and virtue in the last chapter of the Ethics, which is the transition to the Politics. His first word here is that those who are brought up well to love the noble need only reminders and exhortations, and it's those people who are badly brought up who need compulsion. But then it turns out that to be good and to stay good, everybody needs law. Why isn't the love of the noble enough? How can virtue be our natural perfection and its exercise the core of happiness if it also needs compulsion? I think there are several reasons here, some lower but some higher. The lower are the disorderly impulses that I just spoke of. Those who are worst brought up need especially strong curbs, but at times we all need them. The higher reason is that our political nature is fulfilled only when we act together for a common good and push ourselves collectively in the right direction. Consider the way a decent person is willing to pay her taxes and often even happy to do her part, but only if others do theirs too. Decent people don't want to be freeloaders, but they want even less to be chumps. They want to be part of a community that's working for everybody. Or consider a people fighting for freedom like the Ukrainians. They still need a draft, they still need military discipline, but what they're doing together with the help of their laws is important to all of them. And finally, virtue needs law behind it because law in the classical understanding embodies not just limits that a community wants to put on people, but the community's own most serious, even sacred recognition of the justice that has a claim on each member. Law in the classical understanding is constraining, but it's also guiding and community forging and meaning defining. For all these reasons, Aristotle denies that acting well is just a matter of individual choice or free will. We all know that if you grow up in a broken family in a terrible neighborhood, your chances of turning out well are not very good. But Aristotle would say we aren't drawing the right conclusions from this in America today. He would criticize equally the liberals that want the law to be enforced more leniently or not at all, and the conservatives who imagine that the community's responsibility ends with law enforcement and that and who fail to take seriously our responsibility to prevent people from going wrong in the first place. This whole teaching about humans' political nature is controversial, but I think Aristotle is right about it, and that the crisis of modern liberalism is due in no small part to our neglect of its importance. It has many different implications, but because leaders and examples are so important, Aristotle might begin with this one. We should attend to the character even more than to the policy preferences of those that we elect to offices of trust. This language of character and virtue has become alien to us, but the present is a clarifying moment. If we ever imagine that a well-designed political order with good institutions would run itself without any need for virtue in its citizens and leaders, it's become obvious that this is not the case. Aristotle has many constitutional and legal suggestions for founders and refounders, in particular, suggestions for all kinds of communities, good ones and bad ones, for making themselves better. He's very adaptive. He's willing even to give advice to tyrants on becoming better tyrants, which is to say, becoming less oppressive. And he's interested in helping each regime to become a better version of itself. Since ours is a democracy, I want to look especially closely in the rest of the lecture at what Aristotle says about democracy and the love of freedom that he says is the defining mark of democracy. Freedom, Aristotle says, is the supposition of a democracy, but democracies go wrong in that they define badly what it is to be free. So how do we Democrats understand freedom badly, and how might we understand it better? And on that basis, what would be an education for it that would most successfully help us to enjoy it well? As Aristotle depicts it, Democrats prize freedom as both a possession that they claim they already have, on which they ground their claim to a right to rule, as oligarchs do with their wealth, so Democrats do with freedom, and they view freedom as a good that they seek. And they make errors, he says, with both. So how is freedom a claim to rule? Freedom in the eyes of the demos in a democracy is a legal status that makes them available to participate in public life, but it's also a quality of soul, to be free-spirited. In the ancient world, most slaves were people who had been captured in battle, and the idea was, if you surrender rather than fighting to the death, that shows that you're a coward, and a free-spirited person is somebody who would never do that. So there was a pride in their freedom for that reason. Aristotle praises, the Greeks were very proud of their freedom, especially Aristotle praises that. He calls it an important foundation for virtue. He points out how a freedom-loving people is the bane of a tyrant. Tyrants hate anybody who has high thoughts or great souls and is bound to oppose them. But Aristotle says this spirit, although it's very important for a healthy, happy political community, it's a good resource, but it needs to be educated to become real virtue. Aristotle's own discussion of natural slavery and freedom in Book 1 of the Politics produces the thought that a natural slave, if such a person exists, and I'm doubtful that such a person does, would be somebody so completely incapable of intelligent self-direction that he would actually benefit from belonging to somebody else and being ruled for that other person's good. By extension, then, the most truly, naturally free and capable of freedom are those people who can belong perfectly to themselves, who can govern their own actions with their own intellects towards ends of their own that are fully worth choosing. Freedom is intelligent self-direction. The second way the demos views freedom is as a goal that they aspire to, the power to live as they like. And this has two aspects. First is political freedom understood as simple majority will or popular sovereignty, as Stephen Douglas defined it, against Thomas Jefferson, who said that the will of the majority to be rightful must be reasonable. In extreme democracy, Aristotle says the populace tries to rule like a despot, unchecked by law. But in fact, it's never able to exert or even know its will without a leader. So when the demos is in control of everything, demagogues are invariably in control of what the demos thinks. The second form of freedom that the demos tends to pursue is individual freedom to live as one likes individually. From this, Aristotle says, has come the feature of not being ruled by anyone at all, preferably, but failing that, of being ruled only by turns. So here we have an anarchic direction, which is sometimes cropped up in our own tradition. As in Patrick Henry's characterization of government as only a necessary evil against the other founders who saw something nobler there. And in libertarianism. Aristotle has the same critique of freedom understood both as doing whatever we like collectively and freedom understood as doing whatever I like individually. And he applies this to everybody, including the nobles. To be answerable to others and not to be able to do whatever one thinks good is advantageous. For the license to do whatever one wishes is unable to defend against the base element in each human being. So here's the kernel of the thought about the value of checks on human avarice and ambition that's familiar to us. But Aristotle still doesn't call these checks freedom, although he says they're important. So what's Aristotle's positive teaching on freedom? Political freedom means having a share with other free citizens in ruling and being ruled in turn. Living freely in this sense is something that we can do only together with others. And according to Aristotle, it's something we can do well only with virtue. And in fact, one of the great merits of free political life is that it offers one of the most challenging and rewarding spheres for exercising moral virtue and practical wisdom. It's this intimate connection between freedom and virtue that underlines Aristotle's doubts about democracy. In his account, different regimes can be more or less correct if they're ordered more or less to the common good. But he says in the best regime, the citizen is one who has the ability and makes the choice to be ruled and to rule with a view to the life in accord with virtue. Democrats are partly right, he thinks. Ordinary unschooled people can judge some things well and can benefit everybody by having a share in judgment and putting a check on the ambitions of oligarchs. But Democrats don't appreciate how much education and time and attention are required throughout adulthood to judge important things well and to avoid the seductions of demagogues. Freedom for Aristotle requires a substantial share of equality, though. In Aristotle's regime, according to Prayer in Book 7 and 8 of the Politics, the citizens are very free and also very equal. They all share equally in an education to virtue and in all the offices of rule. And this is an interesting sign that Aristotle thinks everybody, if given a good education, is capable of handling big responsibilities well. But also in his most practicable regime, best regime, polity, Aristotle connects freedom to a spirit of equality and to the moderate virtues of a middle class. He says where there's too much inequality, there's arrogance on one side and envy and resentment on the other. So a city of slaves and masters arises, not of the free. So note the implication that to be powerful isn't yet to be free. Political freedom belongs only to partners in a decent community characterized by reciprocity and trust and shared purpose. For both ancient Democrats and contemporary Americans, Aristotle would say the same thing, I think. You think freedom is being let alone or having your way without opposition. You think living as a free citizen is something easy that you can do in your spare time with a fraction of your attention, but it isn't so. Freedom is a noble work that requires your very best virtues, and it offers an unrivaled field for their very best deployment. Aristotle argues that the most important thing for sustaining any regime, and a thing that almost every regime tends to neglect, is giving the young an education well tailored to that regime. So how might we adapt his principles to do a better job of educating young Americans to sustain democracy? Aristotle discusses education, especially in laying out his regime according to prayer at the end of the Politics. And he argues that since all the citizens are going to share in self-government, they should all receive a serious education in common at public expense. For his regime, which rests on an economic foundation of non-citizen agricultural laborers, this education is largely an education for serious leisure, but it's also for helping the citizens to take part in self-rule and in the citizen army. In America, where almost all of us are workers, education needs to give much more attention to putting a solid economic foundation under each young person. But there's time in 12 years to do lots of things well if we put our minds to it. Aristotle would surely blame us for our carelessness here. As it is, less than a quarter of 18-year-old Americans meet the Army's basic requirements for physical and mental health and academic achievement and a clean criminal record. If Aristotle's healthy republic includes a citizen army, ours should include at least an army qualified citizenry. But also, isn't a project like this something that the left and the right in our divided polity should be able to get behind? Doesn't a serious dedication to equal opportunity require that everybody have the resources to compete well? And doesn't a serious dedication to equal results demand that we raise everybody to a high minimum standard, not only of income, but of self-respect on the basis of income that they've earned and having a healthy body? This project would require serious dedication to giving every citizen basic intellectual competency and vocational training and apprenticeships for those that don't attend college. Lots of liberal democracies do these things well, and the best tend to be ones that pay teachers well. American liberals are foolish to allow teachers' unions to block progress, but conservatives are equally foolish to allow their passion for low taxes to obstruct such a crucial investment in our democracy. Or to imagine that the teaching profession can be reformed without winning over the teachers. As Aristotle says, what you want people to do well and take seriously, you have to honor. We need to elevate teaching to an esteemed and competitive profession. If we're too unwise to value the profession that forms minds and guides souls on a par with the one that just cures bodies, we should at least aspire to narrow the gap. This project would require at its heart a better moral and civic education. We would need to develop more thoughtfully a vision of characteristic democratic versions of Aristotle's virtues of justice and moderation and courage. Not only the great courage to dedicate blood and treasure for freedom, but the lesser courage of personal resiliency and grit, and the willingness to stand up for unpopular and politically costly truths. It would require fostering a democratic version of practical wisdom, the intellectual virtues of respect for truth and truthfulness, independent judgment combined with a reasonable respect for science and expertise, and moral seriousness combined with openness and tolerance, none of which come naturally to human beings. To support these virtues, we need the right story to tell ourselves, about what America has been and is trying to be, about what the human spirit needs to thrive, and why the American experiment is a promising way to provide it. We need a story of our history that models honesty and balance. It needs to help students understand the mixed motives of human beings and the mixture of selfishness and decency that have shaped America. It needs to teach a sober realism, but especially hope. So it needs to include dark, unvarnished facts, but also stories of inspiring individuals who have made us better. Wilfred Maclay's Land of Hope is a good example of a history textbook that a great civic education could be based on. But I know you want to ask, don't our divisions make agreeing on any such project impossible? And without good common public schools, can we ever have a common civic faith? This is a real problem, but I think we have a resource precisely in our American habits of pursuing liberty in many different ways on different levels, with our tradition of federalism and localism, our First Amendment protections of assembly and religious communities, and volunteerism. So an Aristotelian reform might take advantage of these traditions. It might build on the idea of small parent-run public schools that Jefferson advocated, and he said would be useful both for educating citizens in reading and writing and arithmetic, but also educating parents in working together to solve collective problems. So why not expand charter schools and even have systems of all charter schools, including parochial ones, each with its own character, from which parents could choose and which they would help to run. If a system like this was not managed carefully, it could help to deepen our divisions. But charters could be made conditional on schools providing not only strong academics, but also an essential core of civic education that would promote understanding of our differences. An all charter system should also include a strong contingent of neighborhood common schools where moral and civic education at the elementary level would be confined to principles that the parents could all agree on, and at the secondary level would present controversies in a way that the majority could at least agree is balanced. If our schools became simply separate bubbles, then just as when our media does, and we're all reading partisan media and sending more polarized members to Congress, our republic will suffer. But if we could have a strong center that lots of families would take part in, and also have room for different choices, that would strengthen our republic. And I think in other ways as well, Aristotle, an Aristotelian reform might give special thought and support to all the small associations that Tocqueville identifies as schools for democracy: neighborhood and civic associations, churches and synagogues and mosques, trade unions and professional organizations, book clubs and charitable groups, all of which make up the sphere of civil society between the public sphere of government and the private sphere of individuals and families. Aristotle's principles don't support a liberalism understood merely as a framework to protect a private sphere so that we can each make money and live as we please. But they would support liberalism understood as a system of layered liberties, a framework for protecting the private sphere, but especially for protecting and fostering small communities of meaning that we need in order to pursue the higher goods of the soul by choice together. Starting with a few charter schools and a few common schools, we could develop, with Aristotle's guidance, a revitalized American civic creed. This would teach that America is a pluralistic nation and that this is a virtue. It would instruct children that America is a free nation and our freedom can be both good and noble, but to be so, we need to use it well. We have an equal claim to partake in a shared prosperity that gives us all a decent floor and equips us to rise. But this isn't enough. We all have needs of the soul as well as needs of the body. Our freedom requires the lawfulness and civility and willingness to live and let live, but this isn't enough either. We're incomplete human beings unless we develop the higher virtues that are hard to cultivate, that almost always require for their cultivation membership in one or another small communities of meaning that allow us to pursue our distinctive visions of human flourishing. Our laws can't fully specify answers to the question of life's ultimate meaning without becoming oppressive, because these questions are contested. But they can give us a start on some of the most basic answers. And full membership in the American Republic could combine that with intense membership in smaller communities that our government was encouraging more than it does. To give serious support to this last thought, we might also pursue an idea that's been floated several times, a system of universal youth service after high school or college. People could choose where to serve in different kinds of organizations, but everyone would be expected to do it ultimately. This could begin as a voluntary project, but following Aristotle's thought that about the importance of law as an expression of people's most serious standards and commitments, it would be best if it was required of everyone. Democratic self-government is not easy. It's in fact one of the hardest things any people has tried to do. But then human beings need challenges to thrive. And this is a great challenge that's worthy of our best efforts. If it were easy, we might have reached the end of history with the end of the Cold War and maybe even become last men. But if Aristotle is right against Nietzsche with his last man, nature gives us rational political animals an inexhaustible source of noble challenges, just in the task of trying to live together well. Thank you.
It is our tradition to let students ask the first questions. I will let you decide who's a student.
Okay. Yes.
Yeah, hi. With the idea of trying to implement like a virtue ethics as kind of some kind of grounding for liberalism, how would you compare your envisioned future of America with like probably currently the biggest experiment in virtue ethics, which is like China's readoption of like Confucian values? Like, how do you see those realities kind of contrasting?
That's a good question. I don't know enough about what China is doing there. I'm very struck by how intensely top down it is, how vehemently China tried to stamp out another movement that seemed to be aiming to help people find community and meaning in community, which was the Falun Gong movement a decade or so ago. And I think especially in a community like ours, imposing one thing from the top precisely makes it something that is being forced rather than something that's growing and something that we're doing together. And so I think it would be especially bad for us, but I have serious doubts as to whether this is good for China, the way they're doing it. Yes.
Hi, my name is Jensen. I am a student here, I'm a senior. So you talked about in your talk about Aristotle and how one of his ideas is of like demos and polis is creating this idea of a like universal idea and project that communities can come together with, and that America is able to foster this with their communities as a plural linguistic community. I wonder that's interesting because I wonder how can I develop like this idea of a common project when America is a country that also values this idea of like the melting pot of many identities. And if do you value that? Like, do you think that is a hindrance or a strength of America, the emphasis on different identities?
I think it's both. And if it is kept within certain limits. So in Canada, they say we're not a melting pot, we're a mosaic. And there's something nice to that. The mosaic has to have a unity to it. There has to be a certain amount of melting that we do, and there has to be a common meaning to being in America. And I think that means especially believing in our principles of justice and our principles of freedom, and having some kind of a shared sense of what a good American is, as somebody who's law-abiding and self-supporting and decent and fair and civil. But just doing all those things doesn't yet give you a rich life. And we don't live in an ancient polis where we can govern ourselves in a face-to-face way with the intensity that the ancients were able to, but we can do something like that in a civic project, in founding a school, in a charitable organization that has the face-to-face character, that has the group of people helping each other to become even better at something that they're trying to do. And I think that what I'm trying to do is splitting apart two parts of what Aristotle wants and saying we can realize one here and one here. And with the right kind of leadership, it can fit together.
Thank you.
So yes, both. Yes.
My name is Christina, and I don't want to be like nitpicky. I really like what you say about the charter schools and like that you make the provision against creating this accidental echo chamber. But what values do you think would be important for getting like you mentioned having a centered position for these charter schools so that it brings in a diverse, and also the fact that it's voluntary?
Yeah. So I'm thinking we really need good common neighborhood schools that lots of parents will be choosing. And one thing those schools could provide would be activities that bring together students from different parochial and classical, what are they? Classical Christian academies and so on. There are lots of these. And I think they do all kinds of wonderful things. I have also heard people who have visited them and taught there said, and they all vote the same way, and they sometimes vilify people who vote the other. So we need bridges, we need some mixing, we need a demand that there be a civics program in every school and a history program that we collectively have something to say about. And if they were coming together on Saturday afternoons and talking about American democracy with people from other schools, they would have to be a little bit less narrow-minded, I think.
Thank you.
Yes.
Hey, I'm Josh. I'm a recent graduate. I want to ask you, you talked a lot about human nature at the beginning of this lecture, and I think I agreed with your point that perhaps the time we live in is too quick to criticize the concept of human nature. But I do think there's also valuable and more sensible criticisms that maybe disagree with the concept. There's a purpose or fundamental metaphysical telos behind human nature.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so in that view, if we're trying to follow modern science with also disagreeing with social contract theory, how do we make sense of Aristotle in today's day and age?
Good. So modern science teaches us, of course, that we evolved, and we evolved as a result of selfish genes, as the work of a blind watchmaker, the evolutionary process that isn't trying to end up with anything in particular. And Aristotle is often thought to be obsolete because he imagines that nature is benevolent and purposeful. And I know he says that, I'm not sure just how serious he was about that thought, about nature having purposes. He says the rain rains in order to water the crops and so on. Yeah, sometimes it washes whole towns away. But I think he's most serious about this idea of a natural purpose when he's looking at the level of individual beings. And he says, it is clear why we have hands. It's clear why we have eyes. They have a function. You can't even think about biology unless you're thinking about function and some kind of purpose. And an organism has a whole, and there's a thriving to that organism. This is why I talked about beavers, because there's such a thing as a good beaver life, and we know that. So then the question is, okay, even if we grant that that's true of our bodies, is there truth to that at the level of our souls? And I think science and evolutionary theory are seeing more and more that, yes, that's true also. That human beings evolved in social groups, evolved to be cooperative, evolved to be intelligent in ways that depended on our being very social and paying attention to each other and setting up common purposes, evolved to be distressed by discord in the group and satisfied not simply in getting everything for oneself or even as much as one wishes, but satisfied when there's fairness. And so one interesting author who works on this is Michael Tomasello, who has a book called Becoming Human. comparing humans to higher apes and comparing young children, even before the age of being able to speak, to young chimps at the same age, and observing how directed we are to being social and cooperative and even moral and caring about fairness. So that would be an argument that nature is directing us to live together in certain ways, to be able to do it and to need to do it. And another part of this idea is that we had to tame ourselves, we had to domesticate ourselves in order to be able to live together and get rid of some of the wilder impulses that are still there, but we've also developed in ourselves these deep needs for human connection. So the answer to that, the fulfillment of that, is to find deep bonds where we find those common purposes that nature makes us at age one already looking for. Yes.
I'm kind of a collapse student. But there are a lot of threads that overlap with what I've read, although I don't think I agree with some of the things that you said. To me, you sound a little bit focused on Locke, and the US political system may be based on that, but I like more David Hume. You know, everything, most things come from the emotions and instinct, and whatever reason there is just to rationalize emotions.
Yeah.
That's a different perspective. It's not virtue ethics. But I want to ask you a question. In terms of your project, making the dialogue in the US better and improving it across the spectrum. One writer who's written on that subject a little is John Haidt, The Righteous Mind.
Yeah.
And he says, he also talks about group identities, but he says, and he overlaps with you in some ways, and he differs. But one way, when he talks about group identities, he says that that's a conservative taste. And the liberals are focused on justice and helping people, and they don't recognize the importance of group identities. And that's one of the problems in a dialogue across the political spectrum. I don't think he's not conservative, but he argues that the taste spectrum of conservatives is much greater and includes group identity. But you know, if you knew his work well, you could say how consistent that is with Aristotle. If you don't, I understand, and it's probably not easy to address it, but there is some overlap.
Yeah, for sure. And I read The Righteous Mind some years ago, so I'm trying to remember some of the arguments. You know, certainly some of the concerns that Aristotle is pointing to that I'm trying to bring out are ones that resonate especially with conservatives. We need a community that's aiming at something high together. But liberals do too. You were talking about, you know, wanting to help. It might not be, the focus might not be on a community as such as much, but there is also a shared purpose there that's really important to them. And if we're a little bit more flexible and open about what kind of communities are important and valuable to humans, we could get thoughtful about how, as a society, we can encourage all of them better than we're doing. And one of the things that's interesting in Haidt's most recent work is his incessant talk about how lonely young people are, how disconnected they are, how social media has been harming that. But the neighborhoods and the communities and the spontaneous friendships that used to be part of their lives are missing. And he thinks there's a mental health crisis here, which I think goes to support Aristotle's thought about how deeply social we are and how much we need connection of one kind or another. There are lots of different kinds of connection.
The only other thing I want to say is this analogy with the animal world is significant, and there are different readings on what the analogies are. There's a guy named John Gray who's written the book Straw Dogs, He's retired, a political philosopher from the London School of Economics. And he's also written a book on cats and humans, which I haven't read. It's what we can learn from cats.
Okay.
And he's very naturalistic. He thinks that humanism and Christianity and religion is utopian chimerical. And
Both humanism and religion are chimerical, and instead we're really just glorified cats.
I have to read that book.
Okay.
But we can learn from them according to Greg. I think that's.
Yes, hello.
Thank you very much, Professor Pangle. And in the account of what advice Aristotle might have for us relative to the deficiencies we undergo right now, which you so eloquently described. One question that occurred to me is this. One political phenomenon that I'm not aware of that Aristotle had to encounter was what we today call movements, political movements.
Yeah.
And these are very powerful and often the way in which we approach every political issue. That's one thing. How would he understand that, and how would he see that ways to either use it or to overcome it if it's an obstacle? Especially given one other consideration, a good number of these movements have as their goal something that we would ordinarily call a utopia.
Mhm.
So they don't recognize, from that point of view, they don't recognize the kind of restraints that you suggest that are implicit basically in Aristotle's prescriptions for a healthy human community. So I mean, it's, in a way, it's an unfair question of you, and it's certainly an unfair
Yes.
question of Aristotle, because we'd have to dig him up to find out what he had to say.
Yes, but a great
But
question.
it does seem to me that our political landscape is so much affected by what are called, what are movements, political movements.
Yeah. And ultimately, I think they trace back to philosophy having gotten out of the barn where maybe it should have been kept and running wild and reading all these ideologies that are in different ways causing a lot of trouble.
Well, certainly lots of them.
Going back to the Communist Party of China.
Right.
Yeah. So Aristotle isn't completely unaware of these movements because he's aware of partisanship. And he understands partisanship to be very closely bound up with self-interest in a way that sounds almost like Marx. But he claims that at the basis of it is not raw self-interest, but a certain view of justice. And what really empowers people to fight with each other is a view of justice that has, he says, in every case, some truth to it, but it's always an incomplete truth. So claims about who deserves to rule and why, and claims about what the common good is that can be achieved he's aware of them, and they were in the world around him, and they've become worse and more complicated for sure in our time. So I think he might say what's most important is educating all of the educable young ones in this audience and the younger ones to be much more thoughtful about justice and much more thoughtful about the limitations of what can be achieved. And I think in a way, his whole politics is addressing that problem. I mean, think about Plato's Republic, this wild utopia. And I don't think Plato meant for anybody to go out and try to build it, but Plato himself as a young man was caught up in the vision of the 30 tyrants who were going to try to fix everything in Athens. And he said he was tempted by that and then realized it was not a good idea. But they're very aware then of that fanatical, one thing that will solve everything. And Aristotle, in all his detailed analysis, he shows if you fix this, it'll help, but you have to worry about that. And showing us humans in their very mixed motives and problematic capacity to really achieve the good that we're groping towards, I think, is an education in moderation that would be very helpful.
At the risk of sounding professorial, and I'm afraid I'm not a student in any technical sense, but insofar as a professor can never not be a student, I am still that. It strikes me that perhaps at least from my perspective and reading of Aristotle, that the most important advice that Aristotle would give America today is to learn rhetoric. Because
Learn what?
rhetoric.
Rhetoric.
Because we're finding not only that we don't understand each other, we don't understand ourselves. We use words thinking we mean one thing and we mean something else. We see people claiming to be in favor of this or that, but when we see something like gays for Hamas, we wonder, is it mere ignorance? So it would seem that and that's it, if you could address this, because increasingly I'm seeing conversations, articles, pundits, professors and so forth saying, can we please define our work? And by the way, liberalism is one of the most important.
Yeah, okay.
And so,
Point well taken. Yeah.
case book,
So Aristotle wrote a book on rhetoric.
yes.
I think he's a little apologetic and a little uneasy about it. There's real value, especially for leaders, to have studied rhetoric and thought a lot about it. And it's a wonderful tool, of course. But the more you teach rhetoric, the more you put tools in people's hands that they can use against each other to deceive and to divide. And that's the problem. So I think he thinks ethics and politics have to come first, and rhetoric can be a supplement to those things, but only a supplement.
But unless you know rhetoric, you can't even start thinking about, and for example, we have all these disinformation websites and so forth.
Yeah.
So if you don't even know that you might be subject to a sophist, that there may be demagogues around. I mean, for a democracy to work well, it has to understand what a demagogue is and the extent to which the demos is susceptible. Sorry.
I totally agree, and I think that's important, but I have this worry. And I think we're trying to do that often in our schools. We're trying to teach kids about propaganda and about rhetoric and make them skeptical and teach what we call critical thinking. And what critical thinking often really means is you're skeptical of everybody and you're a cynic. And so there's another thing that we need, which is actually respectful, humble, even reverential thinking, the ability to look up, the ability to identify a hero or somebody who's worth deferring to. And either one of those without the other is not good. They have to be put together. And George Washington, I think that was in his farewell address, gives a wonderful account of how you need vigilance, but you also need reverence for the laws, something that Aristotle talks about. So, right, it's very complicated. Yes.
Gays for Hamas is rather like chickens for Colonel Sanders. Thank you for your eloquent talk. It's real tour de horizon of Aristotle. David Hume came up earlier. I believe it was he who said that the love of reason is among the faintest of men's passions. Which is a very
true.
Very un-Aristotelian.
Not completely, but go
Well,
ahead.
no, I know, but you cited Aristotle that education should be publicly funded. And I want to press on that a bit. You did talk about charter schools, which are publicly funded. Is not one of the great problems today in a deeply divided nation, which we are, that the whole idea of an elite class being involved so deeply in an institution that is so funded by the government has resulted in the kinds of battles that we are seeing in school boards across the country today over what should be taught. And maybe the answer is to, much as we have separation of church and state, separation of school and state, and private funding would be a way to allow 1,000 flowers to bloom, and the poor educational options would, as in all market contexts, wither away such that the more virtuous versions would come, assuming that the love of reason at least has some place in our life.
Okay, thank you. There's a lot in there. Let me say something about Hume first. So in response to Hume, Aristotle came back after Hume wrote that. And he said, yes, I agree. Thought alone moves nothing. It's thought together with passion that does move us to do the things that we do. So choice is deliberate desire or desire directed by deliberation. He also makes the interesting comment at one point, he divides up the soul into different parts. You know, there's the part that controls nutrition and growth, and there's the part that is semi-rational and then it can listen to reason in a way that a dog can listen to its master. That's the passions, but then there's real reason. But he makes this comment, you know, whether the soul really has parts or whether they're actually just distinct in concept, but no more separate than is the convex and the concave of a single curve, I won't go into. And I think the thought is there to see that something is good with your mind and to desire it with your heart is two sides of the same thing. That the judgment that Aristotle is concerned with is a judgment that is seeing the good and desiring it. And that without that, without these concerns that we have, these wants that we have, reason wouldn't be able to guide us. He's not saying we need to listen to reason and go against our passions, the way Kant says, but it's more a single whole of seeing our deepest concerns and learning how to follow those out. As for charter schools and elites, I don't know. I mean, charter schools have done especially well with disadvantaged kids. And the idea of charter schools is an embrace of a certain kind of market competition to help raise the level. But if we treat education as something that should be simply a matter for the private market, and whatever anybody wants should go and the government shouldn't have anything to do with that, I think that would be a denial of the importance of our doing this important thing together as best we can, and a giving up on something absolutely essential that as Americans we all need to be concerned with, and I'm not ready to go there.
Even a little?
Well, I think having charter schools with lots of variety is, and certainly allowing private schools. There's no call here to banish the private schools, but we need to have lots of options for all parents that are just as good as that. Yes.
Yeah, thank you for talking to us today. My name is Hannah Haidu. I'm a freshman here at American, and as I was reading through your work, something I kept considering was our current situation here on campus. Because recently, back in January, there was a policy put out by our president. I'm not sure if you're familiar, if anything was similar at your university, but basically, our administration has put a ban on indoor protesting, flyering, and political activity. and being a part of our student government here, I kind of just kept going back as I was reading your work, thinking of our institution, our university as this body and our student orgs as these smaller parts that make up this sort of collective organization. And I guess what I was just wondering is, since I'm sure you're familiar as a professor with like the recent protests and moves by student organizations and movements into campuses. I was just wondering, what would Aristotle's advice, I guess, if we could bring him back from the grave, be to these universities where these smaller parts of this body are disagreeing so strongly against what the virtue or the goal, I guess, of the entire body would be, and what sort of happens when these smaller parts find that their virtues, being part of the collective, actually differ completely from the larger organization.
Yeah, good. Well, just before the lecture, I was saying to Professor Merrill, I really don't know what I think about all these protests and exactly what the universities are supposed to be doing. So this answer is very much a work in progress. I think part of the vehemence and the vitriol that we have now comes from the fact that we have not for a long time been doing a good job of moral education and teaching people how to be decent and civil and self-restrained. And instead we've taught relativism. And that's been a kind of vacuum, and people aren't content to be relativists. And so they're going to the other extreme and latching on to things that they are ready to fight for and they feel passionately about, and completely denying the legitimacy of alternatives. So that's a big part of the problem. Another part of the problem, I think, is in the way that we're thinking about freedom of speech and the freedom to protest and the intellectual freedom that we're trying to promote as a university. And it's easy to think of it in terms of a free market and ideas. I don't like a simple free market in schools, and I don't like a simple free market in ideas either. Because if we just have a market and there's just competition and anything goes as long as certain rules are being obeyed, we don't have a community where we care about each other and we're engaged together in a common purpose. A university has got to be a community that has a common purpose. And going back to what Aristotle says in book 1 of the Politics about how a true community, we have to care about each other's characters. In a university, I think it's the intellectual virtues that we especially need to attend to, which include intellectual courage and honesty and civility and so on. And universities have not been doing a good job of saying why practicing those intellectual virtues is critical for us. So we're left either banning the speech or thinking we have to allow people to spew whatever hatred they want to spew and we can't do anything about it. We maybe shouldn't punish it and expel people, but we definitely should answer it and say, this is harmful. This is not why we're here. This is tearing us apart. I would like the president of my university, who just drove a lot of protesters off the grounds of the university, to have instead said, you can do this, you have a right to do this, but I'm ashamed of some of what you're saying. We can do better, we are better than this. You had your hand up earlier.
Well, so I just want to endorse the question that came up. I think it's a great question. It's one that we're all grappling with. I don't have a very good answer, except that clumsy attempts to shut down speech usually backfire. That's one lesson one might have learned from the last semester. So enough about that. I want to ask you a question about liberalism and about your view of the status of liberalism. And I can unfold the question in a catty way. This way is, what's the difference between you and Patrick Deneen? That would be one question. But one could ask it a little bit more formally, which is,
I'm nicer than you.
well, I know, but that may not be a virtue in terms of honesty, right? But in terms of theoretically, I mean, you spoke movingly about the state of nature, and you said something that I think is really smart, which is, for us, the state of nature has moved from being something in the past to something in
a prophecy about how we live our lives, how we see ourselves.
Yeah.
For your, I mean, I hate to say this, but aren't the things you talked about, charter schools and rural communities and totalitarian federalism, is that all sort of small ball compared to, don't you really have to say that somehow Locke was wrong and should really be displaced from the place that he has? I'm trying to be a little bit blunt with the law, I'm sorry.
Yeah, so, I mean, my big disagreement with Patrick Denis is that he thinks the American founding was just wrong. We got off on the wrong foot, that it was secretly trying to break up all of our little communities and religion and just make us these atomized individuals. I don't think that's true at all of what our founders were trying to do. I do have a big disagreement with Locke. I think he really misunderstood human nature. But when I read our founders, I don't think that they were very, I think they were pretty wise. I think they were taking certain things for granted that they shouldn't have taken for granted. That certain things would remain healthy if they weren't given any special protection and cultivation. But I think they had a vision of America as a community and as a community of communities that is a place where the human spirit can thrive and where noble things can happen. And I don't think with Deneen that we should at all reject it and hope for something better, but we need to shore it up.
I like an awful lot of what you said, but the term neighborhood sounds awfully hopeful in the sense that many things that we would geographically describe as a neighborhood really have become a state of nature, like the solitary, poor, nasty British, and often short.
Yeah.
I know surveying this scene about 20 years ago, James Q. Wilson said, maybe we should have a system of free boarding schools. So anybody can enroll their child in a boarding school with, and with minimal regulations, certain things that they have to do, health safety and so forth. But the logic would be that the very act of living together will induce certain responsibilities that you have to recognize some of the limits of your freedom like this. It would be very expensive, and the rhetoric surrounding this has to be handled carefully. Newt Gingrich made the mistake of saying orphanages. Everybody say free boarding schools. What would you think of that? Seems like we need to go down to a deeper level than, because we have the breakdown of the family. Before you have the neighborhood, you need a family. And many areas where we don't have that. So this was a maybe revitalizing those virtues that would lead to at least maybe families, maybe neighborhood.
It sounds like a good experiment. As you say, it would be a very expensive experiment. I think it would be good for some of the kids that would go to it. I think families are very important when they're functioning, and that without families, we're totally sunk. But I think that would be one model that should be encouraged.
It's more economical in the long run, he argued.
Yeah, there's a big problem with our short-sightedness. I mean, if we just had really good schools where the kids live. In New York City, what do they spend? $27,000 per kid. Well, you pay one good person to take care of 4 kids anywhere, and they can do a better job than those schools are doing. So we've got to break up the system and try something different and have some competition. I totally agree with you on that.
It's worse in DC.
How much is it in DC?
It's 30-something.
Where's it all going?
The
teachers are not getting rich.
It sounds like a prescription for a generation of twits.
We're gonna watch you one.
Yes.
Well, this may be too hard to question, but it seems like a necessary one.
Okay.
Once one becomes charmed by all your suggestions, one tends to immediately think, well, how do we get there from here? What are the obstacles to getting there from here? And you start out with a complaint about our current situation. So then the question arises, how did that situation arise? And what are the trends which would have to be combated? So, I mean, some things are just institutional. Like if you have primaries which exclude independence, the middle is excluded from a lot of voice in selecting your candidates and so on. That's just institutional. But obviously things go much deeper than that. I mean, there are the social things and political trends which led to that decay in common purpose, in political understanding, et cetera. What can you say anything about identifying what led to the problem, and therefore how one can counteract those things which would be resisting your suggestions?
I think too much, I mean, here I do agree with Patrick Deneen, too much individualism, I think, is central to our problem. And therefore looking for ways of building communities and connections is most important. How to get to an America that's doing all these things well, I think it's not likely that we will. And sometimes I think this project is silly for that reason. But I think that it can be helpful to somebody just to have an image, a clear picture of what it would be good to be trying to move towards. With whatever small steps we move towards it, that can be helpful for parents raising their children, thinking about what does this child need to thrive that the surrounding community isn't likely to be providing. So I would hope that, you know, a movement towards more good schools, more charter schools, more healthy choices could kind of help us to hold on until, I don't know, our government comes to its senses. Something has got to give. We can't continue at this rate. And then maybe some better policies would result.
So are you speaking in favor of charter schools?
Mhm.
Okay, so are you, I guess what I'm confused about with charter schools is my mother was a public school teacher. And I feel like there might be like a problem that comes up with like being in favor of more charter schools, because that will just underfund public schools even more, I feel like, possibly, because that's taking away money that public school teachers who are already not paid anything, even more money away from them. Yeah.
Yes, but the problem is not so much that there isn't enough money, as that we're spending it so badly.
Yeah.
And so I think that this would have to go along with raising teachers' pay in a dramatic way.
Yeah.
And then teachers would not have lifetime tenure in the way that they have now. That would be a problem. People in other professions don't either. But when the profession is highly respected and highly paid, you move from one job to another, and that's okay. You view yourself not as a labor member, but as a professional, and that's better. So these things would have to go together.
Maybe I'll ask the last question. We're running low on time. Does Aristotle think that virtue is possible? I mean that seriously. Is it an actual thing that humans can actually live virtuously, or is it aspirational? And kind of like Plato's Republic, and you know, a model to aim at, but.
Well, that's like saying, does Aristotle think that intelligence is possible? Yeah, lots of intelligence is possible. And nobody has perfect intelligence, but that doesn't make it in any way not real. Good sense is possible, but nobody has it perfectly.
Right, so.
Moral virtue is just like that.
So we could, that means we could be more virtuous, right? There's more or less virtuous. There's better than and worse than.
Sure.
But not sort of the ultimate standard would require like perfect judgment aligned with perfect desire. And
right, and that would ultimately require perfect wisdom about yourself and about everybody around you and about the human good. And perfect wisdom is not available, but we can certainly do a lot better than we mostly do.
Okay, I agree with that.
Okay. Thank you all.
Look forward to seeing you all again next year.
Yep.
Yeah.